In part 4 of our videos here, we're going to look at gender-linked traits, or what are known as sex-linked traits. And when we look at this process, we have to remember, if we look at this picture of a human karyotype here, you can see all 23 pairs of chromosomes lined up from basically a picture that was taken of a cell that was going through mitosis. They've been stained with a fluorescent dye to make different regions of the chromosomes visible to basically facilitate the process of lining these guys up. And you can see we start out with the longest chromosomes in the upper left corner. Those are chromosomes 1. One of those chromosomes came from mom, and one of those chromosomes came from dad. And we go all the way through these chromosomes, getting shorter and shorter until we end up with what are known as the sex chromosomes, but should more properly be termed the gender chromosomes, because this is what determines the gender of the baby. And if we look at this idea and think about all of these chromosomes are packed into every cell in your body except for your gametes, where they've gone through meiosis and produced those haploid cells. So your cells that we find in your body, or somatic cells, are diploid cells, and they have 44 autosomes, all of these other chromosomes there, and then these 2 gender chromosomes over here. And so if we look at this process, and remember, Mendel came up with what is known as the law of segregation, and during the process of meiosis, each of those chromosomes from those pairs is going to segregate, so that each haploid cell that comes out of that process is going to end up with one copy of those chromosomes, and on those chromosomes are our genes. So you get one of those copies from your parents, either the dominant or the recessive trait that would be found in your parents. And so if we look at this process again and think about over here, we can see this somatic cell went through the process of meiosis, and the male produced the sperm. He's got 22 chromosomes in there, and then this gender chromosome, either the X or the Y. So those cells divided and produced these cells right here. And a similar process took place in the female. Meiosis produces the egg cells, those haploid gametes, with again 22 of those autosomes and then those gender chromosomes there. And we drop this into our Punnett square, and we can see this process here for all 46 of those chromosomes have been reestablished in this diploid cell. And this would be something like the zygote that you get when that sperm fertilizes the egg. That individual is going to be produced from this one single zygote cell, is going to divide over and over and over by mitosis and produce the individual that can grow up to make that really just a big mass of trillions of cells when we're looking at an adult there. And again, if you remember from our rules of probability video, this is where we get that chance of 50% of the kids are going to be potentially boys and 50% are girls. Remember, when you're looking at this process, though, this is probability. Each of these boxes is the result of independent events. So again, you can have multiple boys or multiple girls, and what happens during the next process is totally independent of what took place in the previous fertilization event. So if we look at human disorders that are out there, we can find that a lot of these disorders are actually caused by a single gene that is located on autosomes that are out there. And we're more familiar with recessive disorders because these are the ones where we see the process. If you look at an albino, you can see their phenotype because they lack that pigment. And if you look at this, look at that, 1 in 22,000 births actually produces an albino child. You look at cystic fibrosis or sickle cell disease. These are also found in certain proportions in our population and are actually found much more probable in different populations of people that are out there. So if we look at sickle cell disease, you can see it's much more prominent amongst African Americans that are out there, whereas Tay-Sachs is much more prominent amongst European Jews. And this is something that used to be very, very prolific or found in these populations, but in modern society we travel around the world more, so there's less and less of this cultural identity, and you can have kids that are coming up with these human disorders that we wouldn't have expected in the past, but that's because Basically, we are spreading our genes further rather than just restricting them to a local population. One of the interesting things that we see here is there are actually dominant disorders, and the one that's not on here that is a little bit shocking is it's actually a recessive trait to have 5 fingers on each hand and 5 toes on each foot. The dominant trait is for people to have 6 fingers on each hand and each foot. So if you were to have kids with somebody and you have 5 fingers and they have 6 fingers, all of your kids are going to come out as those F1 hybrids, and their phenotype is going to be 6 fingers on their hands and 6 toes on their feet. So we want to take a look at this idea of gender or sex-linked traits that are out there. And in this case, I took away the autosomes, and we're just going to focus on those gender chromosomes. And in this one, we put a little letter next to these chromosomes to indicate this is the normal trait that is out there. So we take our normal male and we run him through this process, and again you can see there is that normal X chromosome, and the Y chromosome is lacking this gene right here. So we don't have to put anything because effectively this chromosome does not contribute to the phenotype, and the phenotype is going to come just from this chromosome over here. We have meiosis occur in the female, and we get our eggs right there. And we drop them down and we look at our probability of these events occurring again. We have our 50% boys and 50% girls, but notice we have this additional modifier on the X chromosome for normal. So let's take a look at some of these processes. Let's take a look at this male over here. And in this case, that male is affected because he has this recessive trait right there on the X chromosome, and that gene is lacking on the Y chromosome. So when his sperm are produced by meiosis, one of those sperm has the Y chromosome and the other one has the X chromosome. Again, independent assortment of chromosomes during the process of meiosis. They segregate independent of each other. We take our female, and in this case she's a normal female, so she has a dominant gene on the X chromosome right there. We drop it into our Punnett square and we look at the results right here. And if you look at all of these, what do we see right here? We see that the boys got the X chromosome from their mom, so they have the normal trait. They must have gotten the Y chromosome from their dad. And remember, the Y chromosome doesn't have that. So here, the dominant trait is going to overshadow what isn't found on the Y chromosome because that gene isn't there. And if we look at the 2 girls down here, what we see is they're known as carriers. The dominant trait overshadows the recessive trait that they got from their mother on that chromosome right there. Now let's take a look at a different case over here. Here we have a normal man and we have a woman who is a carrier. We go ahead and do our meiosis for our cells again to get our haploid gametes. And again, if you look at the male sperm over here, you've got your normal X chromosome and the Y chromosome. And if we look at our female, we split those 2 chromosomes, one normal and one with the affected gene right there. We drop it into our Punnett square and we look at the results. And look at this thing right here. There you can see there's a normal boy and there is a recessive trait on the boy. So this boy is going to be affected, but look at the daughters that come out of the process. The daughters are going to be carriers, and when you look at the boys, only 1 out of 4 is going to be affected right there. So we can see there's a difference if you get these gender or sex-linked traits from the male or the female. And let's take a look at our presumably normal male over here, produces normal sperm or the sperm with the X chromosome, and we look at a female who is affected. She has both copies of the recessive trait on her X chromosomes. Meiosis is going to produce those eggs, and in this case, both of the eggs have that recessive trait on them. So think about what's going to happen when we drop these, or when we have the fertilization event occur between the sperm and the eggs right here. Sit and look at this and think about what's going on with this process. The autosomes aren't playing a role in this. We're looking at gender or sex-linked traits. How many of the boys are affected and how many of the girls are affected? And if we take this out and look at the results right there, all of the boys are affected. the boys must have gotten the Y chromosome from dad, so it doesn't matter what the trait is like on the X chromosome from dad, because the boys have to get the Y chromosome from dad. And here the girls get the other chromosome from their dad. So in this case, they get the normal trait, and they got that affected trait on the X chromosome from their mom. Either one of these chromosomes has the affected one. And so in this case, all of the girls are carriers there.